Good evening, and welcome back to another journey through the myths and legends that shaped the ancient world. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Get comfortable, settle in with a warm drink or soft pillow, and prepare yourself for a story that has captivated humanity for thousands of years. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most beloved and haunting tales from Greek mythology. The story of Persephone, a young goddess whose fate would explain the turning of the seasons, the mysteries of death and rebirth, and the eternal bond between mother and daughter. Her myth is one of transformation, of loss and reunion, of darkness and light intertwined so completely that neither can exist without the other. This is not simply a story about a maiden stolen away. This is a tale that the ancient Greeks told to understand why summer's warmth gives way to winter's cold, why seeds must descend into darkness before they can rise into light, and why the most profound changes in our lives often come from the places we least expect. Persephone's journey from innocent maiden to powerful queen, from Kore the daughter to Persephone the sovereign of the dead, is a transformation story for the ages. Her myth gave birth to the most sacred mysteries of the ancient world, rituals so secret that initiates would rather die than reveal what they had witnessed. So let us begin at the beginning, before the abduction, before the pomegranate seeds, before the seasons themselves were born. Let us start with a world of eternal spring, where a mother and daughter lived in perfect harmony, unaware that the earth itself was about to split open and change everything forever. In the time before Persephone's story truly begins, the world knew a different kind of existence. Demeter, the great goddess of agriculture, harvest, and grain, walked the earth with purpose and power. She was one of the original Olympians, daughter of the Titans Cronus and Rhea, sister to Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. Among all the gods, she held a unique and vital role, for without her blessing, nothing would grow. The wheat would not ripen in the fields, the barley would not swell in its husk, and the fruit trees would bear nothing but empty branches. Demeter was not a goddess content to remain on Mount Olympus, distant and aloof from mortal concerns. She walked among humanity, teaching them the sacred arts of agriculture, showing them how to plow the earth, when to plant seeds, how to reap the harvest. She was the goddess who made civilization possible, for what are cities and kingdoms without bread? What is culture without the surplus that farming provides? In her hands, she held not just sheaves of grain, but the very foundation of human society. And Demeter had a daughter. Born from her union with Zeus, the king of the gods, this child was everything bright and beautiful in the world. They called her Kore, which simply means the maiden or the girl. It was a name of innocence, of youth unspoiled, of potential not yet realized. But we know her by another name, the one she would take after her transformation: Persephone. As Kore, she was the embodiment of spring itself. Where she walked, flowers bloomed. When she laughed, the meadows seemed to respond with color and life. She spent her days in the company of nymphs, those lesser divine beings who populated the wild places of the world. Together they would gather flowers, dance through groves, and enjoy the perpetual warmth that Demeter's happiness ensured. There was no winter then, you see. Or if there was, it was barely noticed. A brief pause between abundance and abundance. Demeter loved her daughter with the fierce devotion that only a mother can know. She was protective, perhaps overly so, keeping Kore close, sheltering her from the harsher realities of the divine world. And why shouldn't she? The gods were not known for their restraint or their morality. Demeter had seen enough of Olympian behavior to know that innocence rarely lasted long among the immortals. She had witnessed Zeus's countless affairs, had watched as other goddesses were pursued, claimed, and sometimes destroyed by the attentions of male gods. She would not let that happen to her daughter. But Kore was beautiful, radiantly so, and beauty among the gods does not go unnoticed. Apollo, the god of light and music, had made his interest known. Ares, the god of war, had looked upon her with desire. Even Hermes, the clever messenger god, had suggested that such a maiden deserved a divine husband. But Demeter refused them all. Her daughter was not a prize to be won, not a political alliance to be negotiated. Kore would remain with her mother, safe and protected, for as long as Demeter had the power to ensure it, and perhaps the world might have continued this way indefinitely. Spring eternal, mother and daughter inseparable, the meadows forever blooming with narcissus and crocus and violet. But there was another god, one who dwelt far from the light of Olympus, who had also seen the maiden core, and unlike the others, he would not simply ask permission. He would take what he desired. To understand what happened next, we must descend. Down, down, far below the green meadows where Core played, far below the olive groves and wheat fields that Demeter nurtured, down past the roots of mountains and beneath the deepest caverns, there lay another realm entirely. The Underworld, the house of Hades, the kingdom of the dead. Hades, eldest son of Cronus and Rhea, lord of the shadowy realm, was not by nature a cruel god. When the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, had drawn lots to divide the cosmos after their victory over the Titans, Zeus had won the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades had drawn the shortest lot. He became ruler of the dead, sovereign over a kingdom that none desired, but all must eventually enter. It was a lonely position, a thankless role. While Zeus entertained lovers on Mount Olympus, and Poseidon rode the waves in glory, Hades sat upon his throne of ebony, surrounded by the pale shades of the departed, administering a realm from which there was no escape. His kingdom was vast and varied. The river Styx wound through it, that famous river upon which the gods themselves swore their most binding oaths. 4 other rivers marked the boundaries and passages of his realm. The Acheron, river of woe, which new souls crossed to enter the land of the dead. The Phlegethon, river of fire, which burned with flames but never consumed. The Cocytus, river of lamentation, where the sound of weeping echoed eternally. And the Lethe, river of forgetfulness, whose waters erased all memory of the life that had been lived. At the gate stood Cerberus, the three-headed hound, who permitted all to enter but none to leave. Within the underworld itself, different regions awaited different souls. The vast majority wandered the asphodel meadows, a grey and neutral place where the shades of ordinary people drifted without purpose or passion, neither punished nor rewarded, simply existing in a pale imitation of life. For the truly wicked there was Tartarus, the deepest pit, where those who had committed great crimes against the gods suffered eternal torment. And for the heroic few, there was Elysium, the Blessed Isles, where eternal pleasure and peace awaited those who had been favored by the gods or had lived lives of extraordinary virtue. Hades ruled over all of this with stern fairness. He was not a torturer. He did not delight in suffering. He was simply the administrator of the natural order. All mortals died, and all came to him. He had not created this system. He simply maintained it. But it was lonely work. Gods visited reluctantly, if at all. The souls of the dead were poor company, hollow echoes of the vibrant beings they had been. Persephone would later be called Dread Persephone in the Homeric epics, and even Hades himself was known by euphemistic names, because the living feared to speak his true name. He was called Pluton, the Wealthy One, referring to the precious metals and gems hidden beneath the earth. He was called the Host of Many, a grim joke about the countless dead under his care. But his true name, Hades, meaning the Unseen One, captured the essential nature of his existence. He was invisible, forgotten by the living, avoided by the gods, eternally apart. Is it any wonder, then, that when he glimpsed Core dancing in the upper world, when he saw her brightness and youth and life, he desired her? He saw in her everything his realm lacked: warmth where there was cold, light where there was darkness, joy where there was sorrow. He convinced himself, perhaps, that she would transform his kingdom, that with a queen at his side, the underworld might become something more than just a warehouse for the departed. He might have told himself that he loved her, and perhaps in his way he did. But love, when it comes from a place of loneliness and need, can become indistinguishable from possession. But Hades knew that Demeter would never consent to such a union. He knew that Zeus, despite being his brother, would be reluctant to anger the goddess who controlled the harvest. So Hades went to Zeus in secret, away from the other Olympians, and made his case. Zeus, who himself had claimed many wives and lovers, whether they consented or not, saw nothing particularly wrong with the proposal. Hades was a powerful god, a king in his own right, ruler over 1/3 of the cosmos. He was not an unsuitable match, and Zeus, always thinking politically, saw potential advantage in binding the underworld more closely to Olympus, so he gave his permission, his consent, his blessing even, though he knew Demeter would never agree. The trap was set, the stage prepared, and Kor, innocent and unknowing, continued her days in the endless meadow, gathering flowers beneath the sun, never suspecting that the earth beneath her feet was about to open like a hungry mouth. The Homeric hymn to Demeter, our oldest and most detailed source for this myth, tells us that it was a flower that sealed Kor's fate. Not just any flower, but a narcissus of impossible beauty. The earth itself, at the command of Zeus and with the cooperation of Gaia, caused this flower to bloom in the meadow where Kori played. It was unlike any narcissus that had ever grown, with 100 blooms springing from a single root, radiating perfume so sweet that the sky itself seemed to smile and the earth and the sea. Kor was gathering flowers with the daughters of ocean, those nymphs who were her companions and friends. They plucked roses and crocuses, violets and irises, hyacinths and all manner of blossoms. But when Kor saw the narcissus, she was transfixed. It called to her the way beauty always calls to the innocent, with a promise of wonder and delight. She reached out both hands to grasp it, to pluck it from the earth and add it to her collection. Her fingers closed around the stem, and the earth split open. It happened in an instant. A great chasm tore through the meadow, and from that darkness came a vision of terrible majesty. Hades in his golden chariot, pulled by immortal horses, their manes like midnight, their eyes like coals. He rose from the depths like a storm from the sea, dark and overwhelming. Before Kor could even scream, before her mind could comprehend what was happening, he was upon her, his arm wrapped around her waist, his chariot wheeled about, and he plunged back into the earth, dragging her with him. She screamed. Oh, how she screamed. Her cry echoed across the meadow, across the mountains, across the very vault of heaven itself. But the nymphs, her companions, could do nothing. They were paralyzed with fear, or perhaps they were bound by divine command. They could only watch as their friend vanished into the abyss. The earth closed behind the chariot as suddenly as it had opened, and Kor was gone. The flowers she had been gathering fell from her hands, scattered across the grass. The narcissus, that cursed and beautiful flower, remained where it had grown, swaying gently in the breeze. The only ones who heard her cry, aside from the helpless nymphs, were Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft and crossroads, who dwelt in a cave and heard everything that moved in darkness, and Helios, the sun god, who sees all things that occur beneath the sky. But they did not intervene. Hecate could only listen, troubled but powerless. Helios merely watched, as was his nature, bearing witness but taking no action. The deed was done with the authority of Zeus himself, and few would dare to contradict the king of the gods, even when his decisions brought suffering to others. Different regions of Greece would later claim to be the site of this abduction. The people of Sicily said it happened on their island, near the sacred springs. The Eleusinians insisted it occurred in their own territory, in the fields near their city. The Arcadians had their own location, as did the Cretans. Perhaps it happened in all these places. Perhaps myth does not obey the laws of geography. Or perhaps, more poignantly, the Greeks understood that such a loss, such a theft of innocence could happen anywhere. Every meadow held the potential for tragedy. Every beautiful flower might conceal a trap. Down, down, down through the layers of earth Hades drove his chariot, through caverns where no light had ever shone, past underground rivers and vast chambers of stone, past the roots of the world itself, and Kor, held fast in his grip, could only scream and weep as the light of the upper world receded and the cold darkness of the underworld enveloped her. She had gone from spring to eternal night in the space of a heartbeat, from freedom to captivity, from daughter to something else entirely. When they reached his palace, carved from black stone and lit by flames that gave no warmth, Hades finally released her. He spoke to her, according to some versions, trying to explain, trying to justify. He told her she would be his queen. He told her she was destined to rule by his side. He promised her honor and power and a throne of her own. But what did any of that matter to a girl torn from her mother's arms? What did queenship mean to someone who wanted only to return to the meadow and the sunlight? She refused him. She wept. She would not eat, would not drink, would not accept the inevitability of her fate. And above, in the world of light, Demeter had not yet realized what had happened, but she was about to discover a grief that would shake the very foundations of the earth. When Kor did not return at sunset, Demeter began to worry. The meadow was empty, the nymphs scattered and silent. There were flowers on the ground, dropped and abandoned, but no sign of her daughter. Demeter called her name. The night gave no answer. She lit torches and began to search, walking the dark paths, peering into every grove and glade. Where was Kor? Where was her daughter? For 9 days and 9 nights, Demeter searched without rest. She did not eat, she did not drink, she did not pause to wash or sleep or tend to her divine duties. She held the blazing torches high, walking the length and breadth of the earth, calling Kor's name until her voice was hoarse. She questioned every creature she met. She searched caves and forests, mountaintops and valleys. But no one could tell her what had happened. No one had seen where Kor had gone. On the 10th day, as dawn broke pale and cold, Demeter encountered Hecate, the goddess who had heard the cry. Hecate came to her with torches of her own, her face grave and troubled. "Lady Demeter," she said, "I heard a voice crying out 9 days ago. I heard your daughter call for help, but I saw nothing. I do not know who took her, but someone did." She did not leave willingly. Hope and horror warred in Demeter's heart. Her daughter had been taken, stolen, but by whom, and to where? Together, Demeter and Hecate went to the one who sees everything. They went to Helios, the sun god, who was even then preparing to drive his chariot across the sky. They stood before his blazing presence and demanded answers. Helios, who had watched the abduction from his position in the heavens, sighed. He pitied Demeter, but he also understood the politics of Olympus. "Queen Demeter," he said, "I will tell you the truth, for I respect you greatly and pity your grief. Your daughter was taken by Hades, lord of the dead. Zeus himself gave permission for this marriage. She has been taken to the underworld to be Hades' queen and wife." The word struck Demeter like a physical blow. Not some monster or stranger had stolen her daughter. It was family, her own brother. And Zeus, her other brother, the king of the gods, father of her child, had given his blessing to this theft. The betrayal was complete. She had trusted them, and they had conspired behind her back to take the one thing she loved most in the world. Rage filled Demeter's heart, but beneath the rage was a grief so profound that it threatened to tear her apart. She left Helios's presence. She abandoned Olympus entirely. If the gods thought they could simply take her daughter without consequence, they would learn otherwise. She would show them what happened when you wronged the goddess of harvest. She would show them the true meaning of loss. Demeter disguised herself as an old woman, hiding her divine radiance beneath the appearance of age and weariness. She wandered among mortals, lost in her grief, no longer caring for her responsibilities. And as she grieved, the earth began to change. Crops stopped growing. The wheat in the fields withered. Fruit fell from trees before it could ripen. The very ground became hard and barren. Demeter's sorrow had withdrawn the blessing of fertility from the world. Eventually, her wanderings brought her to Eleusis, a small town near Athens. She sat by a well, the place that would later be called the Maiden's Well, resting in the shade of an olive tree. She looked like any old woman worn by life and sorrow. And there, the daughters of Celeus, king of Eleusis, found her. They were coming to draw water, these 4 young women, and they saw the old woman sitting alone and offered her kindness. They asked if she needed shelter or assistance. They spoke to her with respect and compassion. Demeter, moved by their gentleness, agreed to come with them. She told them she was a refugee fleeing from pirates who had captured her. She said her name was Doso. The daughters brought her to their mother, Metaneira, the queen, who welcomed the stranger into her home and offered her work as a nurse for her infant son, Demophon. Demeter accepted, and for a time she found a small measure of peace in caring for this mortal child. But even as she nursed Demophon, her grief continued. She would not eat the food offered to her. She sat in silence, her eyes distant, until finally a serving woman named Iambe managed to make her smile with crude jokes and earthy humor. The hymn to Demeter suggests these were sexual jokes, the kind of bawdy humor that sometimes breaks through even the deepest grief. Demeter laughed briefly and accepted a drink called kykion, a mixture of barley, water, and mint. It was the first sustenance she had taken since her daughter's disappearance. As Demophoon grew under her care, Demeter decided to give him an extraordinary gift. She would make him immortal. Each night, in secret, she would lay the child in the fire, burning away his mortal nature, anointing him with ambrosia, the food of the gods. Had she completed the ritual, Demophoon would have become divine, never aging, never dying. But Metanera, checking on her son one night, saw the child in the flames and screamed in terror. Demeter interrupted in her work, threw off her disguise. Her mortal appearance burned away like mist before the sun. She stood revealed as a goddess, radiant and terrible, filling the hall with divine light. "Foolish woman," she cried, "you know not what you have done. I would have made your son deathless and ageless, but your fear has prevented it. Now he will die as all mortals do. Yet for the kindness your family has shown me, I will bless this place. Build me a temple here in Eleusis, and I will teach you sacred rites and mysteries." The family of Celeus, terrified and awestruck, obeyed. They built the temple as she commanded, a great hall near the well where she had first rested, and Demeter withdrew into that temple, sitting in darkness and grief. She refused to return to her duties. She refused to make the earth fertile again. She simply sat, mourning while the world began to die. As Demeter's grief continued, the earth descended into crisis. Without her blessing, nothing would grow. Seeds placed in the ground refused to sprout. The fields that had once waved with golden grain stood empty and desolate. The orchards bore no fruit. The meadows, once lush with grass, became dust and dead stalks. Winter came and would not leave. It was a winter not just of cold, but of utter sterility, as if the earth itself had given up on life. Mortals began to starve. They offered prayers and sacrifices to the gods, begging for relief, but the gods could not help them. This was not a natural famine. This was divine will made manifest. As long as Demeter withheld her power, nothing would change. People began to die. Children, the elderly, the weak and sick, all fell to the creeping hunger. Cities that had been prosperous found their granaries empty. The strong began to prey on the weak, fighting over scraps. But it was not just mortals who suffered. The gods themselves began to feel the consequences. Without mortals to make sacrifices, the gods received no offerings. No incense burned on their altars. No animals were slaughtered in their names. The savor of burnt offerings, which the immortals found pleasing, ceased entirely. The gods began to realize that Demeter's grief was not just a personal tragedy, but a cosmic crisis. If mortals all died, who would worship the gods? Who would remember their names? Zeus, comfortable on Olympus, finally understood the magnitude of what he had done. He had thought himself generous in arranging a marriage for his brother. He had thought Demeter would eventually accept the inevitable, but he had underestimated a mother's love and a goddess's power. Demeter was willing to let the entire mortal world die before she accepted the loss of her daughter, and she had the power to do it. Zeus sent messengers to Demeter one after another. Each god and goddess came to the temple at Eleusis, bearing gifts and offering honors. They promised her anything she wanted: new temples, greater worship, whatever her heart desired. But Demeter refused them all. Her answer was always the same: "Return my daughter to me. Until Persephone stands at my side once more, the earth will remain barren." Zeus had no choice. He could see that Demeter would not bend, and he could not force her without risking war among the Olympians. She was too powerful, her control over fertility too fundamental to the natural order. Finally, reluctantly, Zeus sent Hermes, the messenger god, down to the underworld. Hermes was to command Hades to release Persephone, to send her back to her mother. It was not a request, but an order from the king of the gods. Hermes descended through one of the secret paths that connect the world above to the realm below. He passed the rivers, greeted Cerberus, and made his way to the throne room where Hades sat in dark majesty. When he delivered Zeus's command, Hades could have refused. He could have declared that Zeus had given permission for the marriage and therefore had no right to revoke it. But Hades was pragmatic. He understood that if the mortal world died completely, his realm would be flooded with new souls, yes, but the order of things would collapse. Besides, Zeus had the power to make his life extremely difficult if he chose. So Hades agreed, but as we shall see, he had one final trick to play, one last card to ensure that his wife would not leave him entirely. When Hermes came to fetch Persephone, she was overcome with joy and hope. Finally, she would return to her mother. Finally, she would see the sunlight again, feel the warmth of the upper world, escape this cold palace of stone and shadow. She had been in the underworld for months, though time moves strangely in that realm. She had refused to eat anything Hades offered, sensing perhaps that consuming the food of the dead might bind her to their realm. But as she prepared to leave, Hades approached her. In some versions of the myth, he is cruel and calculating. In others, he is genuinely saddened by her departure, having come to care for her despite the violence of how their relationship began. He offered her a gift for her journey, a pomegranate. This fruit, with its tough red skin and its interior filled with jewel-like seeds, was both beautiful and symbolic. In ancient Greek culture, pomegranates were associated with marriage, fertility, and blood. The red juice of the seeds looked like blood, felt like blood. To eat pomegranate seeds was, in some wedding rituals, a symbol of consummation, of the bond between husband and wife. Whether Hades knew this symbolism and used it deliberately, or whether he simply offered the fruit as a gesture, the myths do not agree. Persephone took the pomegranate. Some versions say she ate willingly, hungry after her long fast and not understanding the consequences. Other versions, particularly the Homeric hymn, say that Hades tricked her, secretly placing seeds in her mouth and forcing her to swallow them. The number of seeds varies in different tellings. Some say she ate 6 seeds, others say 4, others say 7, and still others suggest only 1 seed was enough to seal her fate. But the number doesn't really matter. What matters is that she ate food from the underworld, and there was an ancient law, perhaps as old as death itself, that anyone who consumed the food of the dead was bound to the realm of the dead. They could not return to the living world permanently. Persephone, either through trickery or simple innocent hunger, had trapped herself. When she climbed into Hermes' chariot and they ascended to the upper world, she was giddy with relief and excitement. She did not yet understand what the pomegranate seeds meant. She was going home. Nothing else mattered. They rose through the layers of earth, past the rivers and the caverns, until finally they burst into the sunlight. The world above greeted her with its brightness, and Persephone wept with relief. Demeter, alerted that her daughter was returning, rushed to meet her. The reunion was everything a mother could hope for. They embraced, weeping and laughing, holding each other as if they would never let go. For a brief, shining moment, all was as it should be. Mother and daughter together once more. Demeter's joy began to stir the earth. She could feel the impulse to make things grow again, to restore fertility to the world. All would be well. But then Demeter, in her happiness, asked the fatal question. "My daughter, did you eat anything while you were below? Tell me, for this is important. Did you consume any food in the underworld?" And Persephone, still innocent of what this meant, told her the truth. She described the pomegranate seeds, how Hades had given them to her, how she had eaten them just before leaving. And as she spoke, she saw her mother's face change. Joy turned to horror, then to despair. "Oh, my child," Demeter whispered, "what have you done?" Zeus, Demeter, and Hades now faced an impossible situation. Persephone had been retrieved from the underworld, as Zeus commanded, but she had eaten the food of the dead and was therefore bound to return. By ancient law, older than the Olympians themselves, she belonged to Hades' realm. Yet Demeter would not accept her daughter's permanent absence. She made it clear that if Persephone did not stay with her, the earth would remain barren forever. Every life would end, every growing thing would perish, and the gods would preside over a dead world. They came to a compromise, as gods often do when total victory is impossible for any side. The solution attributed to Zeus himself, though some versions credit Rhea or other gods with mediating the dispute. Persephone would spend part of each year with Hades in the underworld, and part of each year with Demeter in the world above. The exact division of time varies depending on the source. The most common version says that Persephone ate 6 pomegranate seeds, and therefore must spend 6 months below and 6 months above. This would make the year evenly split between presence and absence. Other accounts say she must spend only 1/3 of the year with Hades, returning to her mother for the remaining 2/3. This version appears in the Homeric hymn and makes sense of Greek agricultural cycles, where the worst of winter was relatively brief. Regardless of the specific numbers, the pattern was established. For part of each year, Persephone would descend to the underworld to rule as Hades' queen. During this time, Demeter would mourn her daughter's absence, and the earth would become cold and barren. Nothing would grow. The trees would stand naked and the fields would lie empty. This would be autumn and winter. When Persephone returned to the surface world, Demeter's joy would know no bounds. She would bless the earth with renewed fertility. Seeds would sprout, flowers would bloom, and the land would bear abundant fruit and grain. This would be spring and summer. Thus, from personal tragedy and divine compromise, the ancient Greeks explained the cycle of the seasons. Winter was not just the earth tilting away from the sun or some impersonal celestial mechanism. Winter was a mother's grief, and spring was not just a warming of the air but a daughter's return and a mother's joy. Persephone herself changed because of this compromise. She was no longer simply Kore, the innocent maiden who had gathered flowers in endless meadows. She had eaten the seeds of death. She had dwelt in darkness. She had become something more complex. In the underworld, she would be Persephone, queen of the dead, terrible and powerful. In the upper world, she could be Kore again, daughter and bringer of spring. She was both now, eternally split between two identities, two realms, two versions of herself. Some modern retellings suggest that she eventually came to love Hades, that she found purpose and power in her role as queen. The ancient sources are more ambiguous. What is clear is that she became formidable. In later myths, Persephone exercises real authority in the underworld. She is not just a figurehead or a captive bride. She rules. She makes decisions. She punishes the wicked and sometimes shows mercy. She is both victim and sovereign, and perhaps that complexity is what has made her story resonate for thousands of years. To the ancient Greeks, this myth was not merely a story. It was an explanation, a way of understanding the fundamental rhythm of agricultural life. They did not have our scientific knowledge of axial tilt and orbital mechanics. They understood the world through story, through divine personalities and their relationships. And the story of Demeter and Persephone gave meaning to the pattern they observed every year. In autumn, as the days grew shorter and colder, they knew that Persephone was preparing to descend once more to her husband's realm. The first frost was a sign of Demeter's sorrow beginning. The falling leaves were tears. As Persephone traveled down through the earth, the goddess of harvest withdrew her blessing. Farmers would gather their crops before winter's onset, storing grain in underground chambers, seeds hidden in the darkness until spring, much like Persephone herself hidden beneath the earth. Winter was the time of Demeter's deepest mourning. Some versions suggest she actually left the earth during this period, going to distant places or withdrawing entirely from her duties. The world reflected her absence. Snow covered the ground like a funeral shroud. Trees stood like skeletons. Rivers froze. Death seemed to reign supreme. It was a little death for the world, a necessary pause in the cycle of life. But always, inevitably, spring returned. This was when Persephone emerged from the underworld, climbing back to the surface to reunite with her mother. The first flowers of spring, pushing up through the last snow, were signs of her return. The Greeks noted that flowers like the crocus and narcissus were among the first to bloom, the same flowers mentioned in the myth of her abduction. It was as if nature itself was welcoming her back, calling to her as she ascended from the dark. When mother and daughter reunited, Demeter's joy was explosive. She blessed the earth with wild abandon, making up for her months of grief. Flowers bloomed in profusion. The meadows turned green. The fields became fertile again. Farmers could plow and plant, confident that the seeds would sprout under Demeter's renewed care. This was spring, the season of return, of resurrection, of life conquering death. Summer was the height of their reunion, the time when Persephone was most present in the upper world and Demeter was at her most generous. Crops grew tall and strong. The grain ripened in the fields. Orchards bore heavy fruit. It was a time of abundance, of harvest and celebration. But even in the midst of summer's plenty, there was always an awareness that autumn would come again. Persephone would have to descend once more. The cycle would continue forever. This explanation resonated deeply with an agricultural society. The Greeks lived close to the earth. They understood that survival depended on the right crops being planted at the right time, on the rains coming when needed, on the harvest being successful. They saw the patterns in nature, and they wove those patterns into story. The myth of Persephone gave those patterns meaning. It transformed the impersonal cycle of seasons into a drama of love and loss, of separation and reunion, of death and rebirth. There's also a deeper layer to the agricultural symbolism. Seeds themselves undergo a journey much like Persephone's. They must be buried in darkness, must die in the cold earth, before they can sprout and grow toward the light. The seed that remains above ground will never become a plant. It must descend, must be hidden away, must endure the darkness before transformation can occur. In this way, every farmer was reenacting Persephone's journey each time they planted. Every harvest was a return from the underworld. The myth made the work sacred. Some scholars have suggested that the myth also reflects the practice of storing grain. The Greeks would harvest their grain in early summer, then store much of it in underground pits or chambers, protecting it from heat and moisture. This grain, hidden beneath the earth for months, was like Persephone herself, seeds in darkness waiting for their return to the light. When the grain was brought back up and used or planted, it was a resurrection, a return from the realm below. The myth also helped the Greeks accept the hardship of winter. It wasn't just random cruelty or bad luck that food became scarce and the world turned cold. It was divine grief, yes, but it was also necessary. Persephone's descent was not a punishment, but part of the natural order. Winter had to happen so that spring could be meaningful. Death had to exist so that rebirth could occur. The Greeks, through this myth, found a way to accept suffering as part of a larger pattern that included joy and renewal. But the story of Persephone and Demeter was more than just an explanation of seasons. It became the foundation of one of the most important and enduring religious practices in the ancient world. The Eleusinian Mysteries, named after the town of Eleusis, where Demeter had revealed herself to the family of Celeus, were sacred rites dedicated to these two goddesses. For nearly 2,000 years, from around 1500 BCE until the 4th century CE, these mysteries were celebrated annually, drawing initiates from across the Greek world. The mysteries were called such because they were secret. Those who were initiated into them took a sacred vow never to reveal what they had witnessed, what they had learned, what they had experienced in the inner sanctum of the temple. The penalty for breaking this vow was death, and remarkably, almost universally, the vow was kept. Thousands upon thousands of people were initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries over the centuries, and yet almost none of them ever revealed the core secrets. What we know comes from oblique references, fragments from Christian writers trying to condemn pagan practices, and archaeological evidence from the site itself. What we do know is that there were actually two levels of mysteries. The lesser mysteries, held in early spring at a sanctuary in Athens, were a preliminary initiation that purified candidates and prepared them for the full experience. These involved ritual bathing, sacrifices, and teachings about the myths of Demeter and Persephone. Those who completed the lesser mysteries became mystai, initiates. The greater mysteries took place in autumn, usually in the month of Bodromion, which corresponds roughly to our September. These lasted several days and involved elaborate ceremonies. On the first day, the sacred objects of Demeter, kept in Athens, were brought in procession to Eleusis, carried by priests and priestesses. Initiates would purify themselves by bathing in the sea, sometimes sacrificing piglets to the goddesses. After several days of preparation, fasting, and preliminary rituals, the main event occurred. A great procession would walk from Athens to Eleusis along the sacred way, a distance of about 14 miles. They walked after dark, carrying torches, singing hymns to Demeter and Persephone. The procession was led by a figure representing Iacchus, a god associated with Dionysus, who was also connected to the mysteries. Along the way, They would cross a bridge where people wearing masks would shout obscenities at the initiates, echoing the crude jokes of Iambe that had made Demeter smile in the myth. When they reached Eleusis, the initiates would enter the telesterion, a large hall capable of holding thousands of people. Inside this hall, something happened. Something was shown. Something was revealed. And this is where our knowledge becomes frustratingly vague, for this was the heart of the mystery, the secret that must not be told. We know that initiates fasted for a period before the revelation. We know they drank a special beverage called kykeon, the same drink mentioned in the Homeric hymn, made from barley and water with mint or pennyroyal. Some scholars have theorized that this drink might have contained ergot, a fungus that grows on grain and contains compounds similar to LSD. This would explain reports that initiates had visions and transformative experiences. Others argue that the power of the mysteries came not from drugs, but from the dramatic presentation, the psychological preparation, and the emotional intensity of the ritual. What we can piece together suggests that the mysteries involved a dramatic reenactment of Persephone's descent and return. There were three elements: things done, things shown, and things said. The things done probably involved ritual actions that the initiates performed. The things shown might have been sacred objects, perhaps including an ear of grain, which is mentioned in some sources as the ultimate revelation. The things said were likely passwords or sacred formulas that initiates would need to know. At some point in the ceremony, likely the climax, there was a brilliant flash of light. The Anacteron, a small building within the telesterion, would open, and something would be revealed. Plutarch wrote that initiates experienced a moment when they beheld a great light, as when the Anacteron opens, changes his behavior and falls silent and wonders. This may have been a symbolic vision of Persephone herself, representing her return from the darkness, or perhaps a vision of the afterlife or the revelation of some profound truth about death and rebirth. Whatever exactly happened in the telesterion, its effect on initiates was profound and consistent. Ancient writers speak of people being transformed by the experience. They lost their fear of death. They gained a new understanding of life's meaning. The poet Sophocles wrote, "Thrice blessed are those mortals who have seen these rites and thus enter into Hades. For them alone there is life. For the others all is misery." The mysteries promised initiates not just knowledge but a better fate in the afterlife. Those who had been initiated would find joy in the world beyond death, while those who had not would wander in darkness. The Eleusinian Mysteries were remarkably inclusive for ancient times. Unlike many religious rites, they were open to anyone who spoke Greek and had not committed murder. Men and women could be initiated. Slaves could be initiated if their masters freed them for this purpose. Rich and poor stood together in the telesterion. Emperors and philosophers were initiated alongside farmers and merchants. The mysteries transcended social boundaries in a way few ancient institutions did. Famous initiates included Plato, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, and possibly even St. Paul, though this last is disputed. The mysteries influenced Greek philosophy, particularly the ideas of Plato about the immortality of the soul and the nature of death. They influenced early Christianity, with some scholars suggesting parallels between the mysteries' promises of eternal life and Christian salvation. The Eleusinian Mysteries continued until 392 CE, when the Roman Emperor Theodosius ordered all pagan temples closed. The sanctuary at Eleusis was destroyed, and the mysteries could no longer be performed. With them died the last continuous link to Bronze Age religious practice, a tradition that had survived for nearly 2,000 years. The secrets, kept faithfully by countless initiates through centuries, were finally lost. The silence of the Mystae became absolute. Today, scholars still debate what exactly happened in the telesterion. We may never know the full truth, but perhaps that's fitting. The mystery remains mysterious, just as death itself remains mysterious despite our scientific understanding. And the core message of the mysteries, the promise that death is not the end, that life returns from darkness, that the cycle continues, remains powerful even now. When Persephone returned to the Underworld each year, she did not return as a captive. She returned as a queen. The transformation that had begun with the pomegranate seeds continued over time, and the innocent maiden core became Persephone, the formidable ruler of the dead. In this role, she exercised real power and authority, making decisions that affected both gods and mortals. Homer in the Odyssey describes her as dread Persephone, always mentioned alongside Hades as a co-ruler. She was not simply his wife, but his partner in governance. They ruled together over the vast realm of the dead, and her word carried as much weight as his. In many myths, it is Persephone, not Hades, who makes final judgments about the souls in her care. One famous story involves the hero Pirithous and his friend Theseus. These two demigods decided they would each marry a daughter of Zeus. Theseus chose Helen of Troy, who was then a child, and abducted her. Pirithous, even more ambitious, chose Persephone herself. The two friends ventured into the underworld, planning to persuade or force Hades to give up his wife. It was an act of stunning arrogance. Hades received them with apparent hospitality, inviting them to sit at his table. But when they sat down, they found themselves unable to rise. The chairs held them fast, bound by magic or by serpents, depending on the version. They remained trapped there, suffering, until Heracles eventually descended to the underworld for other reasons and managed to free Theseus. But Pirithous remained trapped for eternity, his punishment for daring to claim the queen of the underworld as his own. Some versions suggest it was Persephone herself who ordered this punishment, angered by the insult to her position. Another myth tells of the dispute between Persephone and Aphrodite over the beautiful youth Adonis. Aphrodite had fallen in love with Adonis when he was still a baby, placing him in a chest and giving him to Persephone for safekeeping. But when Persephone opened the chest and saw how beautiful the child was, she refused to return him. She wanted to keep Adonis for herself. A divine dispute erupted between the goddess of love and the queen of the dead. Zeus, called upon to mediate, made a judgment. Adonis would spend 4 months of the year with Aphrodite, 4 months with Persephone, and 4 months wherever he chose. It's a clear parallel to Persephone's own divided existence, and it shows her exercising power and desire in ways that mirror the male gods. She was not passive. She claimed what she wanted and fought for it. In the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, Persephone plays a more sympathetic role. When the legendary musician Orpheus descended to the underworld to retrieve his dead wife, he played his lyre and sang with such beauty that even the dead wept. His music moved Persephone's heart, and she convinced Hades to allow Eurydice to return to life, though with the condition that Orpheus must not look back at her until they reached the surface. The tragedy that followed, Orpheus's inability to resist looking back and Eurydice's second death, shows that even Persephone's mercy had limits. In some mystical traditions, particularly the Orphic Mysteries, Persephone was said to have given birth to several divine children. With Zeus, who came to her in the form of a serpent, she bore Zagreus, an early incarnation of Dionysus. Some sources also credit her as the mother of Melino, a goddess of ghosts and nightmares. With Hades, in various accounts, she mothered other underworld deities. These myths emphasize her role not just as queen, but as a creative force, capable of bringing forth new life even in the realm of death. Persephone's dual nature made her a complex figure. In the upper world, during her time with Demeter, she was associated with spring, flowers, and young growth. She was the maiden, the bringer of new life. But in the underworld, she was the queen of death, stern and powerful, capable of punishment and judgment. She embodied both sides of the natural cycle, birth and death, growth and decay, light and darkness. This duality made her particularly important to women in ancient Greece. She represented the transition from maiden to wife, from daughter to mother, from innocence to experience. Her story acknowledged that these transitions could be traumatic, even violent, but also that they led to power and authority. She was a goddess who understood loss because she had experienced it, who understood transformation because she had been transformed. The ancient Greeks were careful in how they spoke of her. Her true name, Persephone, was sometimes avoided, especially when referring to her underworld aspect. She was called the maiden, or the daughter, or given euphemistic titles like the dread goddess. This reticence reflects the fear and awe she inspired. She was not a goddess to be invoked lightly. She ruled over the one realm that all mortals must eventually enter, and her favor or disfavor could determine what kind of afterlife one might expect. The myth of Persephone has been interpreted in countless ways over the millennia. To the ancient Greeks, it was primarily an explanation of the seasons and the foundation of their most important mystery cult. But even in antiquity, thinkers recognized deeper meanings in the story. The most obvious interpretation concerns the mother-daughter relationship. Demeter and Persephone's bond is one of the strongest in Greek mythology, and their separation and reunion forms the emotional core of the story. For ancient Greek women, who often married young and moved to their husbands' households, away from their mothers and birth families, this myth spoke to a universal experience of loss and longing. Persephone's abduction could be read as a violent version of marriage itself, the taking of a daughter from her mother's care. In this reading, Hades represents not just death but the patriarchal structure that claims women, separating them from the maternal bonds that nurtured them. Zeus's permission for the abduction represents the father's traditional right to arrange his daughter's marriage without the mother's or daughter's consent. Demeter's grief and rage represent the mother's loss and her eventual powerlessness before patriarchal authority. But importantly, Demeter does not remain powerless. She uses her control over fertility to force a compromise. She cannot prevent her daughter's marriage, but she can ensure that it is not total, that Persephone returns to her regularly. The myth also speaks to coming of age and the loss of innocence. Kore the maiden becomes Persephone the queen. The girl who gathered flowers becomes the woman who rules the dead. The transformation is violent and unwanted, but it is also inevitable. All must grow up. All must leave childhood behind. The pomegranate seeds represent the irreversibility of this change. Once eaten, once experienced, one cannot return to true innocence. Persephone can visit her mother, can return to the upper world, but she is forever changed by her time in darkness. From a spiritual perspective, the myth explores the relationship between life and death, showing them not as opposites but as parts of a cycle. Death is not an ending, but a transformation, a descent that makes ascent possible. The seed must be buried before it can grow. The initiates of Eleusis learned this truth, understanding that death was not to be feared because it was part of the natural order, as necessary as winter before spring. Some scholars have noted that Persephone's myth shares elements with other ancient stories of descent into the underworld. The Sumerian goddess Inanna descended to the underworld to visit her sister Ereshkigal, dying and being reborn. These parallels suggest that the Persephone myth may have very ancient roots, possibly predating the arrival of Greek-speaking peoples in Greece. The cult of Demeter and Persephone may have absorbed and transformed older agricultural and fertility rituals. Psychologically, the myth can be read as a story of individuation and the development of the self. Persephone begins merged with her mother, without independent identity. Her abduction, traumatic as it is, forces her to develop her own identity separate from Demeter. She becomes her own person, powerful in her own right. The fact that she must divide her time between two realms suggests the complexity of adult identity, the way we must balance different roles and aspects of ourselves. Modern feminist interpretations have wrestled with the myth's implications. Some see Persephone as a victim, her story a warning about male violence and the theft of women's autonomy. Others see her eventual power as queen as a form of agency and argue that she finds purpose and identity in her underworld role. Some retellings, particularly contemporary novels and adaptations, imagine Persephone choosing to stay with Hades, falling in love with him, making the best of a bad situation. These versions often soften the violence of the original, making the relationship more consensual. The truth, as often happens with ancient myth, is probably more ambiguous. The Greeks did not shy away from depicting the gods' cruelty and the unfairness of fate. Persephone's story is tragic, but it is also triumphant. She survives, she adapts, she becomes powerful, and in doing so she becomes essential to the functioning of the cosmos. Her annual return is what makes spring possible, what allows life to continue. She is not merely a victim, but a fundamental force of nature. The pomegranate itself carries rich symbolism. Its red color and juice suggested blood, life force, fertility. Its many seeds represented abundance and potential. In ancient wedding customs, pomegranates were associated with marriage and consummation. Hades' gift of the fruit to Persephone can be read as a claim, a bonding, an assertion of their relationship. By eating the seeds, Persephone accepts, however unwillingly, a connection to him and to his realm. She becomes bound not just legally, but symbolically. When Christianity became the dominant religion in the Mediterranean world, the worship of Demeter and Persephone ceased. Temples were closed or destroyed. The Eleusinian Mysteries were banned. The old gods became demons or literary figures rather than objects of worship. Yet the story of Persephone survived, preserved in the texts that medieval monks copied, studied by scholars who sought to understand the classical world. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical mythology. Artists painted scenes of Persephone's abduction. Poets invoked her as a symbol of spring and renewal. She appeared in masques and operas. In literature, she became a figure representing the cycle of nature, the relationship between life and death, the power of transformation. The Victorian era saw particular interest in Persephone as a subject for poetry. Algernon Swinburne wrote multiple poems exploring her story. The pre-Raphaelite painters depicted her in rich, symbolic works. Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Proserpine shows her holding the fatal pomegranate, her expression somber and knowing. These Victorian interpretations often emphasized her as a tragic figure, innocent, corrupted, light stolen into darkness. In modern times, Persephone has appeared in countless retellings and adaptations. She features prominently in Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series, where she appears as Hades' wife, powerful and sometimes sympathetic. Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles and Circe helped spark a renaissance of mythological retellings, and numerous authors have written novels centered on Persephone's story from various perspectives. Some modern retellings like Receiver of Many by Rachel Alexander, Neon Gods by Katie Robert, or A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair reimagine the Hades and Persephone relationship as a romance, emphasizing her eventual agency and power. These versions often diminish or remove the abduction element entirely, making their relationship more consensual from the start. While these adaptations can be problematic in how they soften sexual violence, they also speak to a desire to see Persephone not merely as a victim, but as a powerful figure in her own right. In psychology and literature studies, Persephone has become an archetype. Carl Jung saw in her story the feminine cycle of death and rebirth, the descent into the unconscious and the return to consciousness. Later, feminist scholars have used her myth to explore themes of female sexuality, autonomy, and power. She represents the complexity of women's experiences, the way trauma and growth can be intertwined, the way power can emerge from suffering. The environmental movement has also claimed Persephone and Demeter as symbols. Their story represents the intimate connection between human action and natural response, the way the Earth itself responds to what we do. In an age of climate crisis, the image of Demeter withdrawing her blessings, allowing the Earth to become barren, resonates with particular force. It reminds us that nature is not simply a resource to be exploited, but a living system that can respond to abuse with devastation. In popular culture, Persephone appears in video games, comic books, and television shows. She is a character in the game Hades, where she plays a significant role in the protagonist's journey. She appears in various Marvel and DC comic storylines. She has been referenced in countless songs, from symphonic works to contemporary pop music. The story of her descent and return, her transformation from maiden to queen, continues to inspire artists across all media. What makes Persephone's story endure? Perhaps it is the universality of the themes it explores. Loss and grief are experiences every person knows. The fear of change, the pain of separation, the complex love between parent and child. These are not limited to ancient Greece. The story tells us that transformation, while painful, can lead to power. That death is not an ending, but part of a cycle. That even in the darkest places, we can find strength and purpose. Or perhaps the story endures because it refuses simple interpretation. Persephone is victim and queen, innocent and powerful, stolen and sovereign. She cannot be reduced to a single meaning or message. Like the best myths, her story contains contradictions and complexities that allow each generation to find new meanings, to see in her journey reflections of their own experiences. As I bring this exploration to a close, I want us to consider what Persephone's story really means, beyond the scholarly interpretations and cultural analysis. This is a story that has moved people for 3,000 years. It moved the ancient Greeks who walked 14 miles in the darkness, carrying torches, to be initiated into mysteries they would never speak of. It moved Renaissance painters who depicted her caught between light and shadow. It moves modern readers who see in her story echoes of their own experiences of loss, transformation, and power. At its heart, this is a story about cycles, not just the cycle of seasons, though that's the most obvious level, but the cycles of life itself, growth and decay, birth and death, joy and sorrow. The Greeks understood that these are not opposites, but partners in a dance that never ends. You cannot have spring without winter. You cannot have life without death. You cannot have joy without the risk of sorrow. Persephone embodies this truth. She is the seed that must be buried before it can grow. She is the daughter who must leave her mother to become her own person. She is the queen who rules in darkness so that light can have meaning. Her annual descent is not a tragedy to be prevented, but a necessity to be accepted. Without it, there would be no spring, no return, no renewal. The cycle would be broken. This is, I think, the wisdom that the Eleusinian initiates encountered in that darkened hall 2 millennia ago. Not that death is to be feared less, necessarily, but that it is to be understood as part of something larger, that the darkness serves the light. That descent makes ascent possible. That transformation, however painful, is the path to power and wisdom. Demeter's story, too, carries profound truth. She is the mother who must learn to let go, not completely, but enough. She must accept that her daughter is no longer hers alone, that Persephone has become something more than core. Yet, Demeter's love never wavers. She grieves every separation. She rejoices at every reunion. And it is her love, fierce and uncompromising, that forces the cosmos itself to bend, to allow her daughter to return. Love, the myth tells us, has that power. In our modern world, far removed from the agricultural cycles that governed ancient Greek life, far removed from the mysteries performed at Eleusis, the story of Persephone still speaks to us. We all experience loss. We all must descend into our own underworlds, whether they are of grief, depression, transition, or transformation. We all must learn to let go of who we were to become who we are meant to be, and we all hope, when we are in darkness, that spring will come again, that we will return to the light, changed but not destroyed. Persephone's pomegranate seeds remind us that some changes cannot be reversed. We cannot unknow what we have learned. We cannot return to innocence once it is lost. But we can, like Persephone, find power in our new understanding. We can, like Demeter, refuse to accept loss as final, can work to bring back what we love even if in altered form. The cycle continues. Winter comes as it always has, as it always will. The earth grows cold, the trees stand bare. But we know, because the myth has taught us, that this is not an ending. Persephone will return. Spring will come. The flowers will bloom again. And chief among them will be the narcissus, the flower that started it all, beautiful and dangerous and irresistible. So as we finish this journey through one of mythology's most enduring stories, remember this: you are part of the cycle too. Your seasons of growth and seasons of rest, your times of light and times of darkness, your descents and ascents are all part of the great pattern. Like Persephone, you are more than you know. Like Demeter, your love has power. And like both of them, you are eternal, not in body, but in the stories we tell, the patterns we embody, the truths we carry forward. The myth of Persephone reminds us that even in the depths of winter, even in the darkest underworld, spring is waiting. Life returns, the cycle turns, and the queen who rules in darkness is also the maiden who brings the flowers. Thank you for joining me on this journey through myth and mystery. If you enjoyed this exploration of Persephone's story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are so many more myths to explore, so many more stories waiting to be told. Let me know in the comments what myth you'd like to hear about next. Until then, may your own cycles bring you wisdom, may your winters be brief, and may your springs be glorious. Good night, and sleep well.